Hello, and thank you for joining us. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our program, Recruiting and Hiring Strategies for the Global Hybrid Workplace. My name is Melanie Turek. I'm a Senior Fellow and Vice President of Consulting with Frost Sullivan, and I will be your moderator today. Joining me to discuss this topic is Dev Das, Vice President of Customer Experience and Operations at Globalization Partners. It's really about what are the key differences between recruiting and hiring strategies for a global hybrid workplace and a more traditional on-site office environment. So we talked about, for the first thing you have to do is you have to be super clear, right, about what your own parameters are at the organization and also for specific job roles. But, let's start with recruiting, right? When you're going out and you're starting to advertise open positions or work your networks or, whatever it is you're doing, how do you use hybrid to your advantage, perhaps? Or, what things do you need to look out for when you're doing that, when you're talking about it that way?
Yeah, I mean, I am very excited with hybrid and remote models because literally what it's done is it's removed the geographic boundaries when we think about looking for talent. It used to be this office is in a certain location. We're looking for people within a 50-mile radius kind of a thing, right? I think that's completely gone away. So I think that's very exciting. But along with that comes complexity. And I think one of the things that companies are grappling with is traditionally compensation is geographically bounded. There are high cost locations, there are medium cost locations, and that's typically defined how you think about compensations for roles and locations. Now you're in a world where someone's applying for a role, they could live anywhere in the country. And how do you think about adjusting your compensation structures to maintain internal equity, which is important, to be competitive with the outside, but also to be flexible. If two people apply for the same role, one's in a high cost location, one's in a low cost location, or a lower cost location, how do you think about that from a compensation philosophy standpoint?
Right. I mean, to me, that's such an interesting question because it starts to really, I don't know, it feels almost boundary crossing on a certain level. Like, in the past, you make what you make and you spend it how you want to spend it. And certainly isn't your employer's business, what you do, right? But it's almost like when we start to talk about location specific compensation, for example, your employer is sort of saying, well, we don't think you should have to spend this much on rent or, on commuting or whatever it might be. So, I mean, do you see any kind of pushback on that? Are employees getting it, or are they like, no, like, I think I should make the same as the next guy, even if he's 3 states over?
Yeah, I mean, generally employers have a compensation philosophy that's based on cost of labor. Employees have a philosophy that's based on cost of living, right? And they're two fundamentally different things, right? And I think companies are really grappling with this now, right? I think some more forward-leaning companies are very open and really talk about like, what does cost of labor mean? And why does that make sense, right? And I think in this new hybrid environment, thinking about cost of labor across different roles and different geographies becomes a critical enabler to getting the right sort of talent in.
And then what happens, we're talking about hiring, of course, but in terms of retention, what happens if an employee was hired at a certain level and then wants to move? Are they dinged? Are they upped in compensation? Like, how does that all work? Is it too soon?
Exactly. I mean, that's a great use case, right? In the old model, it would be very simple and very cut and dry, right? You're moving from a high cost of labor location to a lower cost of labor location. Some companies, depending on how flexible they are, would adjust, right? But I think that in this new model, you really need to think about like, does location matter anymore? Right? Somebody in a high cost of labor location may be willing to take a lower compensation rate because of the flexibility of hybrid.
Right.
And then that starts to bring in internal equity location. So internal equity considerations. I really think that the cost of labor philosophy and the fact that things are traditionally segmented by high cost of labor, lower cost of labor, that needs to be completely rethought. And it's foundational to how compensation benchmarking and companies think about compensation. So it's a pretty significant shift.
Yeah, that's a significant shift indeed. Another question I had around, hybrid and recruiting and hiring is, how do you know that a person is right for a hybrid role? I think we all know what happened over the last few years. And of course, some people were just forced into working from home. And, some people loved it, some people hated it. What do you do when you're faced with somebody and they want to work from home, but you don't know if they can? Or you've got a hybrid model, but they're desperate to get back into an office. How are you flexible with that, and how can you understand the person in front of you and their ability to do that?
So, we've been experimenting with different approaches here, and I know that many companies have been. But it starts in the profiling process, like as you're profiling candidates, as you're interviewing them, to look for those kinds of markers. In many ways, collaboration over Zoom or over whatever kind of video conferencing technology that the company is using is in some ways harder than just whiteboarding in a room with a group of folks. And I think that the more that the interview process can start to test and select for those sorts of things, then you have a greater indicator of success in a role that will be primarily remote, for instance. And I also think that companies need to offer multiple channels of collaboration. Some people love Zoom. Some people hate being on video. Some people need local office locations to be able to go into it and collaborate. Some folks like to be able to get together with teams. And I think the more that companies are structured about saying like, all right, 1 week of the month, we have everybody in the team, optional or not, to get together in this location. Even simple policies like camera on, camera off, right? How do you think about video when it's very early in the morning or very late at night? And what's the expectation for interaction in these, remote communication mediums that we have? Companies are starting to grapple with what those guidelines should be, because they start to get into diversity inclusion issues as well, which is very important and very challenging in this, in this hybrid world. But those are the sorts of things I think the more structure and the more thought that companies can put into them and make that transparent, and then start to look for that as you're interviewing folks. I'll say one more thing. A lot of these things I'm talking about, like diversity and inclusion, it's very intertwined with the company's own identity and culture, right? And I think just in the same way that different companies had a different feel to their physical locations, I think companies now, based on their culture, will start to have a different feel to their hybrid work environment.
That's a really interesting point. And so what stands out to me, of course, is, one of the big shifts we've seen in recruiting is that so much of it is moved to Zoom, right? To being online first, at least initially, but sometimes for the entire process. I mean, it is very often the case that you will no longer meet someone in person. I can remember when I got my job at Frost Sullivan many, many years ago. I drove to the Denver airport so that I could meet up with my boss, my future boss, who was flying through the Denver airport, because we had to meet, even though I was never going to be working in the same place as he was, but we had to do this. And that's sort of gone out the window. So what are some of the things, though, that you would look for in a remote interview that would make you comfortable or less comfortable about hiring somebody?
One of the things that we probe for, and again, this is very much like may not be right for your company, right?
Sure.
One of the things that we have noticed is that Zoom interactions, video interactions, are typically more taxing than getting into a workshop for a day in a room, right? In the old days, workshopping for a day in a room, whiteboarding, meals brought in, that was very common and in many ways very energizing. You can't do a Zoom call for a day, right? Like that's really draining, right? And so what we're looking for is folks that can establish, collaborate, create relationships, get work done in snippets, right? Half-hour snippets, 1 hour snippets. Can folks be successful and be effective in that kind of environment? That's like one of the key things that we're looking for.
Thanks, Dev. We really appreciate your time and your insights today. And if you'd like to learn more about GP, you can find them on the web at globalization-partners.com. Additional on-demand episodes can also be found at the address on your screen.